November 15, 2024. In the rubble of a bombed factory outside Kharkiv, Ukrainian investigators made a discovery that would expose the fundamental failure of Western sanctions against Russia. Scattered among the twisted metal and broken concrete were dozens of semiconductor chips, each one smaller than a postage stamp but worth more than gold on the black market. The chips weren't Russian, they weren't even Chinese, technically. According to their markings, they were manufactured by American companies like Texas Instruments, Analog Devices, and Intel. But their journey to this Ukrainian battlefield revealed a supply chain so complex, so shadowy, and so profitable that it had turned America's ironclad sanctions into Swiss cheese. Each chip had traveled thousands of miles through a network of shell companies, fake manifests, and willing accomplices. From semiconductor fabrication plants in Taiwan and South Korea to distributors in Hong Kong and Shenzhen, from logistics companies in Kazakhstan and Turkey to defense contractors in Moscow. Along the way, these tiny pieces of silicon had accumulated markup after markup until their final price was nearly 10 times their original cost, but they had reached their destination. And now they were powering Orlan 10 drones that were dropping bombs on Ukrainian schools, hospitals, and apartment buildings. This is the story of how Russia turned sanctions into a business opportunity, how China became the world's largest sanctions-busting operation, and how America's attempt to starve Russia of technology ended up feeding a black market that made sanctioned goods more valuable, not more scarce. The war in Ukraine was supposed to be different from previous conflicts. For the first time in history, the West had implemented what officials called unprecedented economic sanctions designed to cripple an adversary's war machine. Export controls banned the sale of advanced technology to Russia. Financial sanctions cut Russian banks off from the global payment system. Energy restrictions targeted Russia's main source of revenue. The goal was simple: to strangle Russia's economy and degrade its military capabilities by cutting off access to the technology needed to manufacture modern weapons. Unlike the sanctions on Iran or North Korea, which had been developed over decades, the Russia sanctions were implemented at lightning speed and with broad international support. 39 countries committed to enforcing the technology restrictions, including every major manufacturer of advanced semiconductors. The Biden administration was confident the strategy would work. At no point in history have export controls been more central to our collective security than right now, declared Matthew Axelrod, Assistant Secretary for Export Enforcement at the U.S. Commerce Department, in September 2024. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan described export controls as a new strategic asset in the U.S. and allied toolkit. The confidence was understandable. Russia had become increasingly dependent on Western technology for its military systems. An analysis of captured Russian equipment by Ukrainian and Western intelligence agencies revealed that everything from cruise missiles to communication systems relied heavily on American, European, and Asian-made semiconductors. Cut off access to these components, the logic went, and Russia's war machine would grind to a halt. But the policymakers who designed the sanctions misunderstood something fundamental about how global supply chains actually work. Semiconductors are not like oil or wheat, commodities that flow through easily monitored pipelines and shipping routes. Chips are small, valuable, and produced in enormous quantities, over 1 trillion per year globally. They are designed to be embedded in thousands of different products and then distributed through vast networks of manufacturers, wholesalers, and retailers. More importantly, the semiconductor industry operates on the same principles as the global drug trade. High value, small size, and enormous demand create ideal conditions for smuggling. A single suitcase can hold hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of chips. A shipping container declared as containing electronic components could actually contain anything from toasters to missile guidance systems. The first signs that sanctions were failing emerged within months of their implementation. Ukrainian forces recovering Russian military equipment began finding fresh Western semiconductors in weapon systems that had been manufactured after the sanctions took effect. Intelligence agencies documented Russian defense contractors stockpiling chips through elaborate procurement networks that spanned dozens of countries and hundreds of companies. But the full scale of the problem only became clear through a painstaking analysis conducted by the Royal United Services Institute, a British think tank, in collaboration with Ukrainian intelligence agencies. Their investigation, published in early 2024, revealed that Russia had not only maintained access to Western technology, but had actually accelerated its procurement efforts. The key to Russia's success was China. According to customs data analyzed by Chris Miller, author of Chip War, China accounted for 88% of the semiconductors that Russia acquired in the first half of 2023, measured by dollar value. This represented a massive increase from pre-war levels, when Russia had sourced chips from a diverse range of suppliers around the world. Chinese companies were not just passively allowing the trade to happen, they were actively facilitating it. The U.S. Treasury Department's investigation revealed companies like Abelfast Logistics in Shenzhen, which had sent more than 170 shipments to Russian end users between May 2022 and January 2024, including lithium-ion batteries, memory chips, and static electric converters that could be used in weapon systems. Another Chinese company, Ace Electronic, had sent more than 300 shipments of high-priority dual-use technology to Russia since January 2024. In 2023, the company had exported American-made radio frequency transceivers that were subsequently recovered from Orlan 10 drones used against Ukrainian forces. The company was not hiding its activities, it was advertising them at electronics trade shows in Moscow. The Chinese government's response to these revelations was a masterclass in diplomatic doublespeak. Officials denied that China was directly supporting Russia's war effort, while simultaneously arguing that China had the right to engage in normal trade relations with Russia. When confronted with evidence of Chinese companies selling dual-use technology to Russian defense contractors, Beijing claimed it was unaware of such activities and would investigate. But the investigations never led to meaningful enforcement. Chinese customs authorities rarely intercepted shipments bound for Russia. Chinese banks continued to process payments for sanctioned goods. Chinese logistics companies specialized in creating complex shipping routes that obscured the ultimate destination of sensitive cargo. The reason for China's reluctance to enforce Western sanctions was not just about preserving its economic relationship with Russia. It was about challenging the entire concept of secondary sanctions, the idea that countries could be forced to comply with restrictions imposed by other nations. From Beijing's perspective, American sanctions on Russia were an illegal attempt to extend U.S. jurisdiction beyond its borders. More fundamentally, China saw Russia's need for technology as an opportunity to advance its own strategic interests. By becoming Russia's primary supplier of semiconductors, China was making Russia dependent on Chinese supply chains in ways that could be leveraged for political and economic advantage. Russia was becoming a client state of China's technology sector, but China was not the only country facilitating sanctions evasion. The Treasury Department's analysis revealed sprawling networks that spanned 17 jurisdictions, including India, Turkey, Thailand, Switzerland, and the United Arab Emirates. These countries had not imposed sanctions on Russia and saw no reason to enforce restrictions that they had not agreed to implement. Turkey, in particular, became a crucial transit point for technology bound for Russia. Turkish companies would import semiconductors and other dual-use goods from Western manufacturers, then re-export them to Russia with falsified documentation. The goods would arrive in Moscow, labeled as Turkish-made products, making their original source difficult to trace. Similarly, companies in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and other Central Asian republics specialized in procuring Western goods and transporting them across long, poorly monitored borders into Russia. The markup on these transactions was enormous, often 300% above normal prices, but Russian buyers were willing to pay premium prices for guaranteed access to sanctioned goods. The United Arab Emirates had emerged as a particularly important hub for financial transactions related to sanctions evasion. Dubai's free trade zones and flexible banking regulations made it an ideal location for establishing shell companies and moving money between sanctioned and unsanctioned entities. Russian oligarchs and defense contractors could maintain accounts in Emirati banks while conducting business with suppliers around the world. India presented a more complex case. While the Indian government had not imposed sanctions on Russia, it also claimed to support Ukraine's territorial integrity. Indian companies were selling dual-use technology to Russia, but often through intermediaries that obscured the Indian origin of the goods. The Indian government maintained that it was enforcing its own export control laws, but argued that it was not obligated to enforce American or European restrictions. The scale of this gray market trade was staggering. According to estimates by the Center for Advanced Defense Studies, Russia was paying nearly twice as much for semiconductors as it had before the war, but it was still acquiring hundreds of millions of dollars worth of chips annually. The higher prices were being treated as a cost of war, funded by Russia's energy revenues, and absorbed by defense contractors who passed the costs on to the Russian government. The markup was so substantial that it had created an entire ecosystem of specialized traders, logistics companies, and financial facilitators who had built lucrative businesses around sanctions evasion. These networks operated like any other global trading operation, with sophisticated supply chain management, risk assessment, and quality control procedures. Some of the most successful sanctions-evading companies had developed impressive operational capabilities. They maintained offices in multiple countries, employed teams of lawyers and compliance specialists, and used advanced logistics software to optimize shipping routes and minimize detection risks. They offered services like sanctions-proof delivery, compliance-neutral sourcing, and geopolitical risk management. The networks were also remarkably resilient. When Western authorities shut down one route or sanctioned particular companies, new routes and companies would emerge within weeks. The Treasury Department found itself playing an endless game of whack-a-mole, where each enforcement action would disrupt trade temporarily but ultimately drive business to new channels. The problem was not just the scale of the evasion, but its sophistication. Russian procurement specialists had learned to break down complex weapon systems into their component parts and source those parts from different suppliers around the world. A single missile might contain chips from a dozen different manufacturers, procured through 6 different countries, and assembled by companies that had no direct connection to the original suppliers. This disaggregated approach made it almost impossible for Western authorities to track the ultimate use of their technology. When Intel sold chips to a distributor in Singapore, it had no way of knowing whether those chips would end up in a laptop computer or a cruise missile. The same components that powered civilian electronics were being used in military applications, making it difficult to distinguish between legitimate and illegitimate trade. The situation was further complicated by the dual-use nature of most semiconductor technology. A chip designed for smartphone cameras could be used in drone guidance systems. A processor intended for gaming computers could control missile launch sequences. Memory chips manufactured for data centers could store targeting information for precision weapons. Western policymakers had assumed that they could control military applications while allowing civilian trade to continue. But this assumption was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how modern technology works. In the 21st century, there is no meaningful distinction between civilian and military semiconductors. The same chips that power the civilian economy also power the war machine. The failure of semiconductor sanctions was creating broader problems for Western strategy toward Russia. The restrictions were supposed to demonstrate that aggression would carry significant economic costs. Instead, they were demonstrating that determined adversaries could work around Western economic pressure through patient supply chain engineering and strategic partnerships with non-aligned countries. Worse, the sanctions were creating precedents that could be used against the West in future conflicts. China was learning valuable lessons about how to insulate its economy from Western pressure. Iran, North Korea, and other sanctioned countries were studying Russia's evasion techniques and applying them to their own procurement networks. The sanctions were also having unintended effects on the global semiconductor industry. Companies that had once operated in a relatively unrestricted global market were now forced to implement complex compliance programs and supply chain monitoring systems. The costs of these programs were being passed on to consumers in the form of higher prices and reduced innovation. Some critics argued that the semiconductor sanctions were actually strengthening Russia's long-term technological capabilities. By forcing Russian companies to develop alternative supply chains and domestic production capabilities, the restrictions were accelerating Russia's drive for technological independence. The same dynamic that had driven Chinese technological development in response to American restrictions was now playing out in Russia. By early 2025, it was clear that the semiconductor sanctions had achieved some of their objectives while failing at others. Russian weapons production had been disrupted, and the costs of procurement had increased significantly. But Russia had not been cut off from Western technology, and its military capabilities remained largely intact. Ukrainian forces continued to encounter freshly manufactured Russian weapons containing Western semiconductors. The factory outside Kharkiv, where investigators had found American chips, was one of dozens of similar discoveries. Each one represented not just a failure of sanctions enforcement, but a testament to the ingenuity of people determined to profit from war. The semiconductor found in that Ukrainian rubble had traveled thousands of miles and passed through dozens of hands before reaching its final destination. It had been manufactured in Taiwan, sold to a distributor in Hong Kong, exported to a logistics company in Shenzhen, shipped to a trading firm in Kazakhstan, transported across the Russian border, and finally installed in a drone that was used to attack Ukrainian civilians. Along the way, it had generated profits for companies in at least 6 countries, employment for hundreds of workers, and revenue for multiple governments through taxes and fees. The global economy had efficiently delivered a product from manufacturer to end user, just as it was designed to do. The fact that the end user was committing war crimes was, from the market's perspective, irrelevant. This was the fundamental challenge facing Western policymakers as they contemplated the future of economic warfare. In a globally integrated economy, every restriction creates an opportunity for creative arbitrage. Every border becomes porous when there is enough profit to be made on the other side, and every attempt to use economic tools to achieve political objectives runs up against the reality that markets, ultimately, serve profit rather than principle. The Ukraine factory had been destroyed by Russian missiles, its workers killed or displaced, its production halted indefinitely, but the semiconductor supply chains that had made the attack possible remained intact, ready to deliver the components for the next wave of weapons. The war would end eventually, but the networks that had profited from it would endure, waiting for the next conflict to create new opportunities in the shadow economy of sanctions evasion. The semiconductor smuggling networks that supplied Russia's war machine were just one example of how economic warfare creates unintended consequences. While politicians promised that sanctions would stop aggression, entrepreneurs around the world were building new businesses around the opportunities that restrictions create. This is the new reality of great power competition. Every wall creates a black market, and every ban becomes a business plan.